screams in the night. Indian legends. Miles of footprints. Sightings. What are these elusive hominids that stalk the wilderness? Join us for eyewitness accounts, questions and answers, Bigfoot encounters of the past, and ongoing encounters in the present. Your host, two-time witness, field researcher for 43 years, William Jevning. Welcome to the mystery. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Creek Devil. Brian isn't with us for this particular interview, but Tom and I have our good friend Dalton. Dalton, how are you doing this evening?
Good, how you doing, gentlemen?
Very good. You had some new developments. I think the best way is just to give you the microphone and tell us what's been going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to talk to you guys again. I've had quite a, I would say, maturing stage in the last couple months since we spoke. It was a pleasure to get a hold of Will and Tom and your guys' organization. I ended up in May of last spring meeting the Creek Devil, and that was a huge shock to my system. Absolutely game changer. And I think the first initial conversations Will and I had were very difficult and very emotional, coming to grips with, growing up in northern Oregon and being an outdoorsman, hunter, and fisherman without having any of those situations take place or even believe that creature existed. And then all of a sudden one day, I would find tracks here, I would find tracks there over a period of time. And then ultimately coming, 72 feet with one of these creatures. You guys remember how difficult that was, right? So where I needed to, or where I wanted to take my information and my experience with that was I used some of my military background and my resources to, first of all, reach out to the guys that still had secret clearances within my soft community and kind of, poke around to see if any other of my mates experienced anything like that. And my first probe in doing that, it was pretty similar to most people's circumstances. I got some of my mates that were kind of pushed back or didn't want to talk about it or pretty much deny that. And then by the luck of the draw, we ended up having a soft reunion with some of my buddies this past summer. And he had graduated from his master's program, and we got to see guys that we haven't seen, in about 15 years. And I ended up hooking up with a guy that we were in an adjacent unit to each other, but still soft operators. And we got to talking about hunting and getting the group together. And he casually took me aside and he said, "Hey, you need to be careful out there." And I kind of laughed and I said, "Yeah, man, cougars and bears and shit's getting overpopulated. The predator population's up and the prey control is down and there's no control over that." And he pulled me aside a little farther and said, "No, man, there's other things out there." And then things kind of got rolling from there. You remember when I told you about that, Will?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so that was another kind of development, and this was about probably a month after I first talked to Will and the guys, and I did my first interview. And I think, Tom, you had said that was like an AA group for PTSD Sasquatch guys, so it was that's exactly what it was. But by this time, I was a lot more poised with my, feelings and security on the issue. So I had met an adjacent brother from another unit, and we decided that he would come with us. Now, each year when I say come with us, my former soft operators and I, we get together, and we either come to Oregon where I live or Washington. We get together and we do a hunt every year. So we put in for these tags And we put it in as a party, and it's pretty standard. So one of us will draw it, and we can go as a party. Well, this year we drew Montana, and my buddy, one of our adjacent buddies, he had some connections to a lease there, and we drew 4 elk tags out of there. Excuse me. So we were going to link up in September, and we had 6 guys, and plus our new buddy that I told you about that I bumped into at my buddy's get-together this summer from graduation. And he had quite a bit of knowledge of the area and intimate, I would say, details of understanding of creek devil, the creatures. So we were able to collectively as a group get on this property that was, I think it had 1.2 million acres that bordered the national forest and other places, but it was a huge ranch, and the gentleman that owns it, one of his contributions back to the veteran community is that he would, allow without guides and contractors to come in. He would, eat one of his tags and let a veteran come in. So we didn't have to pay anything. He put us up. It was an awesome experience. But there was kind of an ultimatum that went with that. My buddy, we'll call him Brian. Brian particularly absorbed information from this guy, got a hold of this guy because we were kind of on the Sasquatch topic. And with his background and what he does, he had some privy knowledge to some events that took place on this particular hunting lease and ranch. And he thought it would be a good idea to collectively get us together as a group after a few of us have had these experiences, and then also set us up in a location where we could, I guess, if the word would be, investigate or experience a little bit more. And we collectively as a group looked at it as 2 objectives. Number 1, the rancher had been having many problems with these creatures on his property. So this guy had this, several, or actually 1.2 million acre ranch that he was not making any money on because most of the local guides would not think twice about going there. They wouldn't even, there's just no way, it didn't matter how good the elk hunting or the mule deer hunting was. The bottom line is that this place had a history to it and nobody wanted to go. So for young men interested in the topic that wanted to get a little bit of experience or further experience on it, and to also help another gentleman out who was having some issues with it, Brian collectively got us together, kind of told us the circumstances, and we were able to spend 13 days on that ranch. The first night we were there, we sat down with the gentleman, and he was, in his mid-70s. He kind of briefed us and told us about the hunting and how things would go up and go down with the wildlife based on the activity of the creatures. And that was a lot of good knowledge because you could just walk outside when it was light and you could see everything. You could see exactly what he was talking about. This pasture used to be full of elk, and now they're way over here. And we would go to this location over there where the elk were supposed to be, and an event took place there. So we would walk his property, and he was explaining year to year the activity and the intensity of the creatures. So he gave us some, really good information on that. And we decided that we would collectively go out as a team and basically bivouac it probably about 14 miles from his house. So we took, I say around 14 miles because we had to go over 2 or 3 ridges. But bottom line, it was far from the security of his general ranch home. And we went over 2 ridges, and where we spent that time, and Will, you guys know about this, there's a formula, right? There's a formula for where these things come down. and the timelines that they come down based on the pathology of that group and based on the topography of that land, right? So we kind of identified that based on the rancher's experience and what he said, and then verifying that with the topography and the range where we decided to stay out. And we, for roughly 13 days, we had action all night, all day, for over a 2-week period. Everything from probably grapefruit-sized rocks thrown at us to all the vocal sounds that have been reported by people who've really been engaged with these things. Everything from sounding like monkeys to screams, to growls, and other events. We experienced on and off for 12 to 13 days. Most of their routine behavior, their anger, the way they hunt in a horseshoe formation, the rock throwing, the probing, what we would call probing, to where one would come in, 2 or 3 would come around on our flanks, one would throw a rock, we would push back a little bit, and then they would retreat. And then when they would go back up in the high country, come back down and bring a couple more friends. So that's what happened, and it's been going on probably the last almost 3 months of my life now, because I decided I needed to go one direction. And I still haven't listened to that first interview I did with you guys, but I was thinking back and remembering that I was on that decisive factor of, was I ever going to go back in the woods again, or was I going to stay completely out of it? And some of the people I've met, you know, in my progression as far as understanding what is going on and how to get back in the saddle with feeling comfortable again. You know, one of the best suggestions is just get comfortable again with being back in the woods. So, you know, kind of guys with the way we're wired, soft guys, man, I had to push all the way. So there was really no gray area. It was either yes or no. So I pushed all the way, and that's what I got myself into this past summer for the last 3 months. Questions, Tom?
You know, Tom's got some.
That was a mouthful.
Yeah. No, that was incredible. You said these things threw grapefruit-sized rocks at you guys, or when you're in the house, or what? How did that happen?
Yeah, well, we the guy's place where we had the lease to hunt, he had said throughout his career there and living there that, you know, this is kind of the best area and where he thinks they come off. And we went over 2 or 3 ridges, pretty good-sized ridges. Like, we actually gained about 3,000 feet from his house. And we stayed in a valley, a big saddle valley area. And we stayed out there collectively as you know, 6 veteran buddies together, you know, doing what they do every year. That's where we had these interactions. And yes, there was no river system around in that saddle, in an area we were staying, that valley. And we literally had grapefruit-sized rocks that we later learned came from 2 or 3 ridges over to where a drainage system and water was. So the fact that these creatures brought weapons, you know, I'm calling them a weapon, man. They were really zinging by. And by the way, all this took place at night when the creatures were most active and giving us their system of how they work. It took place from as almost an hour after it got dark to roughly an hour before it got light. And these grapefruit-sized rocks came whizzing in the timberline from both our front and to our left and to our right. And we had about a 100-meter standoff from where we were in a group and bedded down where our camp was basically. But we could hear these things coming and whizzing by, breaking branches. And then we would, once it got light and the creatures, retreated, when it gets light back up to the high country, we went and found these rock-size, grapefruit-size boulders they had brought with them. And nowhere, anywhere within the base of the valley where we were staying was there any type of rocks like that whatsoever. So
I think that's a pretty accurate statement, calling them a weapon, because, when you have a grapefruit-sized rock being thrown at you, that's definitely a weapon.
Yes, by any standards, yeah.
Yeah, you'd be dead.
Yeah, that indicates a pretty high level of intelligence, if you're coming to prepared, bringing rocks in from another area to utilize that way.
Exactly. And that showed us a couple of things, like you're saying, Will. Number one, that level of cognitive thinking that, hey, I'm going to go approach these people, and I need to think through some tools that I got to gather. So I'm going to go down in the river system. And that river system, well, it's a creek, but it is exactly where the rocks were brought from. That they had actually gathered them, took them on roughly a 2.5-mile hike where they came from, brought them to the site, which was us, and threw them in our direction. And then that paired up with the fact that I think when I originally, got home and I talked to you, Will, I was, I said, yeah, there was basically 2.5 days where we had no action. There was nothing, because you already identified that they went back and got their friends. So the first group that we think that we dealt with was about 3 to 4 individuals. Mm-hmm. And then over those 2 days or 3 days when we and when I say push back, we didn't fire any shots. We did things that, I'm not prepared to talk about, and the reason I don't want to, because I'm not advocating for anybody. Let me say this clear. People, you need to stay away from these things, and I advocate strongly you don't go out and try to seek these things. So, shame on me if I say some of the things we were doing to push back, but I guarantee we didn't fire one shot, and things were done very smoothly, very purposely. But we, like I said, with our background as a collective group of former SOF operators, not that we know anything about these things, but we knew enough based on our body posture and our stance, how loud we talked, how we walked, dressing the same. We did a few things that in the outcome of this was it confused them, and it was able to keep them off of us for the remainder of the days we were out there.
And that's not unrealistic. I mean, when you look at how other primate groups behave, posturing is a way of communicating, that this is my territory and so forth. So it's very good, a very good thing to do, very reasonable kind of a thing.
Sure. Well said.
I was curious a little bit. These things are throwing rocks. Basically, they're a ballistic missile. That would be, it'd be lethal, it'd be fatal if it hit somebody, or certainly cause very serious injury. Were they just hitting the ground, or did any of them ever, hit any structures or the house, or was it just when you guys are out in the field?
Well, when we decided, there wasn't any house. The only house that was there was, like I said, the rancher's home, which was, over 2 ridges and back in his homestead area. But these things, again, I don't know the velocity. It was dark, but you could clearly identify that these big rocks were flying through the limbs and hitting and cutting the limbs. And where we felt safe when we got into this mess was we had, what I call it, I guess we had like an LOA, a limit of advancement where we felt comfortable to where we were in the open, using as much open area as we could be within and along the timberline.
Oh, okay.
And these things never, ever, they never came out of the timber. They use the shadows. They are masters at knowing how to use the light and the dark. But going back to your assessment, if they would, again, it's hard to, just by the sound of it, it'd probably kill you if it hit you in the head.
Yeah.
If I had to do this again, I would definitely be wearing some type of a helmet or protective something on my head, to protect my noggin. But
well, you sure wouldn't want to get hit with a rock that size.
No, not by any means. And where we actually found the track, they were throwing these about 60, 65 yards from where we could actually see them. And the way they would do this was there would be a really solid really good thicket or stand of timber, big timber, and they would be right along the edge of it. So where we identified where they were, where the rocks actually landed coming out in the opening, these things by no means, they would hold pitching records that, would beat Sandy Koufax and Nolan Ryan. I mean, that's the bottom line. That's some of the, instead of following my gut instincts, which was to never get involved in this again, right, and go back out in the woods, again, with kind of how I'm wired, I was able to use some of the former contacts with the soft operators that I know and who are still my best friends. And, lo and behold, somebody in our group or our team has had encounters with these things. And, I don't know if you ask 1 out of 20 people in the Northwest, chances are 2 or 3 or 4 probably have had some type of interaction with that. So that kind of statistic, I think, carries across the board over to everything and everyone. But I needed to know more about these things, and my goals for going back in the woods were, my wife and I, we don't buy any type of store-bought meat. We literally harvest everything that we go out and hunt or that we catch. That's just, based on the lifestyle that we want to live. So my options were pretty simple, that I get back in the saddle, I get some poise and understanding and experience with this, and I get back out in the woods.
Well, that's reasonable. I mean, it's either go out in the woods or go to Walmart.
That's right. That's right. That's
did
right.
You, I mean, that would be a huge distraction, but I'm just curious if you even had a chance to go out and get any hunting in while you're there, or is it just engaging these things? And if you did you have any success?
So the funny part about this is that our elk hunt went for a month, about 3 weeks long, and this all happened within the 2 weeks, and we did absolutely zero hunting because of this. So we basically ate our tags, and we all decided to come home. Half the guys came back to Northern Oregon where I live, and the other guys, this actually shook them up. I want to talk about that for a second. So you got 6 guys that 2 of them are sergeant majors. We're all former senior enlisted team leaders. And this event that we experienced together was a really good marker. And what it marked was all of our combined battle experience together that we did in the Middle East and abroad is completely benign. It's completely non-accounted for when you're dealing with situations like this. It's just 2 different things. And I've heard you say that too, Will, that and we agree that, this, for most people that encounter one of these things, and then having that marker as a veteran, not that it diminishes or takes away from any of those really difficult things that we went through, but it absolutely pales it in a different format, because we could put combat in a box. We know who we're fighting. We train up all the time. I'm not scared of anybody, but it would be unwise, an absolute lie, for any combat guy to say they don't fear these things, because there's something to be said about that. And I just want to throw that out there.
And I think the big difference is, when you go into combat, of course, I did my 10 years in the Army. I didn't go to combat, but when you're training to fight an enemy, you're not concerned about them eating you. Whereas these creatures, you're kind of on the menu, so there is that possibility.
Yes.
I think it goes through your mind when you see one of these things.
Absolutely. And these things do take people, and they do eat people. That is, we should have been listening to our Native American friends all along. They know the truth. They've held the truth since the beginning. Where was it going? Yeah, so Tom, anyways, we ended up going to Montana to specifically, get our elk meat, and this situation became something else. But yes, I did fly home to Oregon, in northern Oregon. I had drawn a special tag, and this is the one that, man, this is the most surprising aspect out of everything. So I deal with this, all of September, early October, and I come home in the end of October. I'm tracking a bull elk, and I'm on him probably as soon as it gets daylight. I cut his tracks, and I stay with him for about 1.5 miles, and look on the map. I said, okay, I got a good idea of where he's going. And I got glimpses of him, so I wasn't pushing him too hard. I could see the top of his horns. I see him put his head down to feed. He was by himself, and things were going really well. I'm thinking, this is great. I can get this guy. So he goes over a ridge and down on a hole, and starts a side hill. So I go up over the top of the ridge, down side hill, and I hit this little little bench. We'll say, it's about a bench, probably 200 feet by 800 feet. And in the middle of the bench, there's a little knob that goes over this little rise that's on a main game trail. So I hit his tracks again. I'm going up this little knob, and right out in the open over this trail, and I don't remember the measurement, guys. What was like 15 inches, somewhere around there. I don't remember, but it was somewhere between a 14 to 16-inch Sasquatch track that was right there. And I mean, I was 5 minutes behind that bull, so you can place that creature between the bull and myself. And I know for a fact I was 5 minutes behind that bull. So I immediately, I get pretty excited. That's the last thing on my mind that I was thinking of. I just got back from Montana. I am hunting in the same general national forest that I have had other things happen, and where I had my sighting, but topography did not match up with what I learned this summer, where one would be at that time. So when I cut his track, it was really surprising to me. And I sent you guys a photo, I sent you guys a video, and you can see on that little knob, and it's not a big one, it's a grade of about 6 feet, over like 100 feet. It just steadily goes up. But right in the middle of the trail where that elk had crossed and stepped was a perfect, 14 by 16 inch print. And you can actually see on the grade where it was digging all four of its toes in the earth. And I remember it was 29 degrees that morning, and this was probably about 10 o'clock in the afternoon, 10 o'clock in the morning. So things were still pretty cold. And I blew one of those things in tracking. If you blow in that track and you can get any aggregate movement, like it's smoking hot, and you could see where the pine needles were pressed down. It was one of the best prints that I've ever seen. Even in Malaysia tracker school, it was just, from a tracker's perspective, it was a smoking hot track. And then I started looking around a little bit more. It was farther than I could step, and to the front of the track onto the right a little bit, that's where the game trail had went over. And there were two big trees that, roughly big enough for, if you wanted to squeeze 2 or 3 bull up through there, you could. So about 15 feet wide. And on the left side of it was really thick, like really thick reprod. And to the right of those, big standing timber trees, there was a little bit more brush, but more open. Well, when I had stepped through and I was trying to find the other track off that track, I found it right on top of a deadfall, and it completely smashed that. And then I had lost the tracks from there. And when I say I lose the tracks, basically when you're stomping tracks out and you're getting down and looking visually, you lose them. But if I wanted to pick up on it and find the broken sticks where it had gone, not a problem. But what I ran into about probably 5 minutes after I had put my pack down, I stomped that other track out. I tied my boots. I got back up directly to my front on the right a little bit where that left-hand stand of timber was and that reprod. It growled. And that was a sound that I had not heard yet. It was super close, maybe 50 feet away. And I immediately just kind of, sprung into like survival mode, like took the safety off, backed out quickly. I had, my rifle up, looked behind my right shoulder, and I backed up about 10 feet, looking, scanning, listening, and then backing up every 10 feet. And then I had to figure out how to get the hell out of there. But it was a very deep, guttural, help me out, Will. You've heard one do that before. It's
yeah,
it doesn't sound like a dog.
No.
Yeah,
like a dog.
It doesn't sound like a. That's what when you tell someone you got growled at, that's what they would think. But it's a very uncomfortable,
I don't
primitive type of feeling, man.
I don't know that I would even equate it to a big cat. Kind of.
Oh.
If you're talking a tiger or something like that when they growl.
Yes, a lot more depth to it.
A lot more depth. Oh, there's something big there.
Big, yep.
And just so people know, we're not talking mountain lion type of growl, not at all.
No, we're talking a big cat.
No.
And that's not even the right sound. It's
right
on par with something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're right. It's hard to describe it. It's different.
Yeah, it's unlike anything I had ever heard. It's an uncomfortable feeling too.
Yeah, let me tell you.
It's almost a want to fight. I think when I got back to my truck, and I told you guys what was going on. That was like you said, it was a challenge, man.
Oh yeah.
Some type of challenge type behavior. But yeah, that was, out of all of the shit I've been involved in this past summer, that was definitely the most surprising, and probably one of the most tense for me, because it was the last thing on my mind, right?
Talk about totally out of the frying pan and into the fire. You went from one, kind of hair-raising experience, and you want to go hunting just to kind of get your mind off things, and you run into another one.
Absolutely, and then in 2 different states as well. So, and I thought that, when I was there, I do hunt solo, and that can be argued either way, but I've just been more successful that way. I trust myself. I trust my abilities. I trust those experiences I've been in. But when I was sitting there, that first hour and a half, all that stuff was going through my mind. But as soon as it got daylight and I could see the timber I was going into, and that's the other thing. The timber, it wasn't quite old growth, and it was between semi-quarter old growth and a lot of third growth and a lot of reprod. So even though I was in the wilderness area, I felt comfortable that I wasn't in a deep, dark, dense forest like when I originally had encountered one of these things. So, shame on me for making those assumptions. But the kicker to this thing, go ahead, Will.
I was just going to say the main thing was, in this circumstance, there was a food source directly there.
Exactly.
So sometimes those settings change. The food issue is a priority with them. So.
Yeah, that's right. It's all about the food. You're right. So I think when we collaborated that day, it was don't go back in there, give that some time. And I really was focused on that bull. I got a good look at him. Definitely a mature bull, definitely something I wanted. So I had, I had definitely backed off, and I think it was when I sent you guys those pictures of the jaws that I found, that was kind of the same vicinity, but that was after I went back, or was that the same day? Do you guys remember?
I think it was the same day, and for listeners, and I guess Tom could put that on the website, that photo, that was a very unusual find because we're not talking a couple of jaws. There was a bunch of them there. Of all things, jaws.
Yeah, they were elk jaws, and they were from several different elk.
Several different elk, and what are we talking about there? It's over a long period of time. Some are old, some are new.
And that's not something you just trip over out in the forest. You might find a jaw,
correct,
but what were there, probably half a dozen in that photo?
The first pile, I think the one that I had a real good picture of, because I was getting pretty nervous after that, because we're thinking baited ambush, right? That these things will bait you. But I think one of the photos that I did send, it had it must have had 5 jaws in it, and all those jaws were from different elk. And the way it was oriented,
extremely unusual.
Almost in a circle, right? Like you had to take hands to do that. And for the people that are going to listen to this, I only hunt in wilderness areas. I take an azimuth and I go. So if I see anybody where I choose to do my hunting at, I will usually retreat from the area and find, especially if I know that the conditions are right, so that I can track and then I can get a bull. So the context is that there was nobody in this area, and I was probably 6 miles in as well. So I didn't cut. The only tracks that I cut were a few bear tracks that day, the Sasquatch print, and then my own tracks and elk tracks. So to rule people out, I feel very confident about that. And it was in a very particular area where, again, it was kind of like on a little knob that you can, two theories here. One, that, people were sitting down having lunch, or it was a baited ambush. But when I squatted down to take a needle look all around me, I could see pretty well. I felt comfortable that, if anything was coming in any direction. So, but that was very, very unusual. That was something else. And yeah, that was the same day I found those tracks. So, and, to wrap this whole crazy thing up, I had backed off and I talked to you guys, and I followed your guys' advice. Don't go back in there. I could tell very straightforward that when that thing growled at me, that it was, leave it, get out of there. It's going to take the bull. That's fine. I had a hard few days because I was pretty pissed. I only had 8 days to hunt. So what I did was I went back in on the last day elk season, for my tag, and I went about 14 miles away in a different direction in a different drainage system. And this is probably the stupidest thing I've done, compared to this past summer in Montana with my buddies and actually some of the other stuff I've done. But I ended up killing an elk that day, and I think it was maybe 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But here's the deal, when when you decide to commit is when you're going to kill an elk or kill what you're harvesting. And the only way to accomplish that is you have to commit all the way. And I started trailing him. I picked his tracks up about 12, and I knew I was getting close. I could see glimpses of him. I could hear him. So coming up on 4 p.m., I had harvested him. And that when you're in that type of situation, you have to make a choice. I was roughly 4.5 miles from my truck, all uphill. So you have to commit either way. When you're in a really tight spot, you're by yourself, you're in the wilderness, you either got to commit 100% to getting out, or you have to commit 100% to digging in. So I decided that I didn't think I had enough oomph to get it out. It was kind of sleet, hail, snow, slush type of situation. So I was already cold and wet. And by the time I got that elk quartered out and hung in the juniper trees there, it was well over 5:30, getting close to 6. And I dug in for the night, and I built 6 fires around me. Some other tactics that my buddies and I got some leadership from, and understanding some particular details about these things on how to combat them. That's kind of one of the things we did in Montana. So I applied one of those scenarios and tactics to staying by myself with that elk, and I did a few other things. And I got super lucky that night. All I heard were owls, and I mean real owls, and mainly coyotes that night. And the coyotes were moving, all around and doing what they normally do. And I was mighty happy by the time it rolled around, about 7:30 in the morning. Things were light. And then I got my ass and my quarters out of there. I spent all day doing it. But that, it kind of sums up, my summer, gents, that, when we had first talked last, I think it was, sometime early June or July, we had talked to where I was coming to grips with this scenario and the fact that trying to push through the experience that I had when I first saw one of these things. I think I pushed way too far, but I still at this point right now, I'm still really good with it. I'm glad I did, because I've had some very, very challenging, very, very intense experiences that I know what not to do, and I wouldn't know those if I didn't, have those hardships and trials through that. So yeah, Tom, I killed the bull.
You got him. All right.
Yeah.
So other than that, you've had a pretty uneventful summer, right?
Yeah, for the most part, you bet.
Well, tongue-in-cheek humor there.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
That's interesting that you mentioned the fires that you had around your camp. I bet that, you just can't help but thinking that probably had an effect on not having these things around. One question I did have was, I didn't quite understand, it was really fascinating, and I think our listeners would be interested too, was you'd mentioned when a track is fresh, when you blow on it. Could you go into a little bit of detail about what you expect to see when you do that and how that works?
Yeah. So, there's all types of formulas, but where you are in the world, what types of soil, I've just learned that here in Oregon and the Northwest. Like I said, I live in northern Oregon, very, very close to the Washington border. When it's basically a certain temperature, and this is only judging with elk because this is the only thing I've really applied it to. So I know elk are anywhere from 600 to 800 pounds. When you're on a smoking hot track and it freezes the night before, and it's in soil, let's say it's mud or fresh mud that's got some moisture to it. Sometimes it can be very, very difficult to see if those animals came through there the night before, a couple of hours, right? So if they came through at midnight and you're walking up on a set of tracks at 7 or 8 in the morning, you think, oh man, they're there. I got to get ready. I'll take the safety off and around the corner. But kind of my mentor had told me about this. There's two things in the Northwest that will tell you how smoking hot a track is. With the particular type of what is called aggregate or soil here in the Northwest, you can put it right on the border, Washington and Oregon. If it freezes and you're able to blow in that track and it can move, it doesn't look like dust, but you're able to move with your solid breath. If you can blow like some dust around basically, but it's soil, that track is less than an hour old. If it looks like a smoking hot, fresh track, and it doesn't do that, it's well over 10 hours old. That's kind of what I meant by that.
Yeah. No, that's very fascinating.
Yeah.
Hey, I wanted to mention something about the fires. First of all, in Montana, did you guys use fires in that situation?
Yes, we did.
I can... Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Will.
I was just going to say that I can relate to, I mean, granted we were teenagers during a couple of situations, but we always felt that, like with the Clark Ranch thing and a couple other times, that the fire was what kind of kept them at bay. Yes,
that would be my, well, not my assessment, that's just my experience. That's exactly, we as people, we feel good because we got liked. But number two, that's exactly, and that's what we did the last night. We actually lit, for you listeners who've been to Ranger School, right? The pyramid, triangle base, where you want to lay in your heavy machine. Just think of a pyramid, a triangle, and at your apex points, those are where you want to have, that's where we set big fires up. And then we filled in the men in between, and then we put 4 other fires in between that area. So we had, at our apex points, on the ends of the triangle is what we call it. Excuse me. That's where we had the flares and the bigger brush. So idea was to clap smaller in instead of out. So we had kind of an opposite thing going on. The bigger the fire, the more the light would push the creatures back, but we would push each other tighter in the group for, back-to-back security. And yes, we actually, like you said, that we got into some major deep stuff the last night because of some of the things we were doing, and the fact that they had brought several of their friends back that last night was kind of our fail-safe to, if they start jumping over these escalations of force, we're going to start having to do this. And yes, the fire very much kept them at bay, and it also gave us more security in the fact that we could kind of see their standoff level, and obviously they could see us. The fire works both ways. Mm-hmm. But they, like you said, they did not like that at all. It kept them curious, but it changed their behavior. That's one of the biggest things is that we figured out, is that it actually changed their behavior. From all the screaming and the hollering, them shaking trees, we could see them swaying back and forth. And the big issue that we had was that when they came back with the group, they actually moved on us a half semicircle like a horseshoe. And that was very, very apparent that somebody in the back was making some type of what we would call fire commands, right? Mm-hmm. Was moving their other...
Was directing the group.
Yes, directing, and that was very, very apparent. And it's not in a dialect or language that we can understand, because, like I said, it was very vocal. You've heard it well. It's dramatic. It's very, very tense. But what we were witnessing was, like you said, they were organizing and moving their group around us, and that's the main reason we lit our fires up. So we didn't have to, take things farther than that.
Right, and for folks listening, when you mentioned the swaying, that is a very classic primate behavior, and it means that they're agitated. That's always all primates when they're swaying back and forth. That's a high level of agitation. So, which means they're not very happy when they're doing that.
Yeah, I would say they were pissed. You got that right, Will. They were and they would hang on, from what we could see, right? Granted, it was at night, but there was no mistake about it that they would hang on to a side of the tree or the trunk of it, and, when they would just very intently, and I only remember seeing one of them, and it wasn't actually the biggest one, it was the middle-sized one that was going back and forth, and then it would change arms. So it'd be moving left to right on one side, and would grab the other side and go on the other side, back and forth. And then the vocals would start, and then things would start moving.
So it was walking back and forth between trees, or just for clarification?
No, it was stationary, and the one I was fixated on was stationary on a very, very good sized tree.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it looked like half of its body was behind the tree. So I'm assuming it was holding on to the side of it.
Oh, I see.
But that's the one I noticed swaying back and forth very, very intensely.
Mm-hmm.
And then it would do that 20 times, and then it would move to the other side of the tree and sway on the other side of it.
Oh, that's interesting.
I wonder when I hear that if that might have been like a misdirection or a distraction for you guys while the rest of the horseshoe comes around and flanks. What do you think?
I think that's possible. I will say that giving myself and my guys credit that we're a group of guys that are very, very aware of the 360 element. So we were already orientated that way, and I know what the guys saw behind me. I know what the guys saw to the left of me. I know what the guys saw to the right of me, and if they were going to breach, they would have to breach us in a circle. But again, we were able to do some things that prevented that. And then again, too, they never came out of the timber into the open. That's the biggest thing that I would take out of this is that where we set up in the open area where we were at, they didn't want to come out of the timber. They never came, and that's where we set the edge of the fire. So that's the witnessing. What we saw was always on the peripheral edges of them using those shadows, using the edge of the shadow of the fire. But even when it was black before we lit those off, and we were looking through our starlight eyes, right? They would never breach in out of that timber line.
And that's very important.
That's one of the things I have scratching my head about is that, why they never breached out of their concealment nest. That's the only thing I can think of. They didn't feel safe in the open, but we did.
And something we do know from my contacts, and folks listening, if you have a situation where they're coming around your home and it's not something you want to have happen, take a look at what's going on with your house. If you have brush or any kind of vegetation growing up close to the house, you want to have it cut back at least 50 feet away, because these things typically don't like to come out in the open. They want to approach a dwelling or a group of people out like you were under concealment. So that's a very important aspect.
And just kind of a follow-up to that, I wonder, this is just speculation, but in the wilderness, I'm wondering if you're in an open area, if you tend to be maybe a little more safe than you would be, say, going through heavy woods where they could just suddenly, they could appear out of nowhere.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're out in the open, you're definitely safer in a situation like that than you are, in a very confined space. Because you have to remember, they are opportunistic, and they're going to utilize, their surroundings for their benefit. So if you're in a space that's confined and you can be grabbed easily, bad place to be. If you're out in the open, you can see them, you can react to them, and I'm sure they know that.
You think about the Pacific Northwest, how dense it is. I mean, we've talked about this. There's places where you have 15-foot visibility all around you,
or less.
Yeah, right, exactly. And the leafy stuff. So, food for thought.
I had played that through my head when I told you where it growled at me, and I'll try and send you the picture again. So where that when I was hunting, when I found that track, and then where it stepped, kind of going at an oblique angle. So if you're looking at 12 o'clock, and if you put the needle at 1 o'clock, there's that big tree. And then to the right of that is that game opening area. Well, on the left of that big tree is where the brush was, and that's where it growled. I had played that in my head, just like the scenario you guys are talking about, that if I would have walked through there, I wonder if it would have grabbed me, because that's exactly where that thing was at. And, there were little pockets of reprod, and, visibility was, at most maybe 50 meters, 60 meters. But that, like you guys are talking about, in the brush on the edge of a trail, you're toast if you're walking by there. I had played that through my head many, many times. Getting it up that way, but that's in my knowledge bank now for sure.
Yeah, looking back when I was growled at, I was still a teenager, but it was in a place, it was near where I had my encounter. And I'd mentioned, as Tom knows it, we had a trail between my home and my friend John's house, and we went up a neighbor's driveway to get to that trail through their property. And I was heading up there one day, the last time I attempted to use that trail, going up their driveway, and fortunately it was open field behind me. And then on the wood side, there was this big patch of blackberry bushes, very thick, pretty large patch right on the edge of the timber. And the whole bush shook violently, and I got growled at. And it was maybe, I want to say, it couldn't have been any more than 10 or 20 feet away, tops.
Wow.
And I stood there and froze, and I said to myself, to hell with this. I turned around, headed back to my house. Never used the trail again.
Yeah, no kidding.
Just wasn't gonna go there. But had I been in a confined area on both sides, could have been a very different situation.
Yeah, no kidding. And go ahead, Tom.
No, I was just going to say their comfort level goes up exponentially with the amount of cover that they have.
Yeah, they're more in control. The more cover there is, the more control they have. The less cover they have, the less control.
So food for thought
that's
for
right.
the hikers out there, hunters, and anybody in the outdoors.
Yeah, I've now that this is such a reality, right, and based on these very intense experiences, which I hold responsibility for. I purposely have done this, and I'm not complaining about that. But before the knowledge, you would walk on a side hill or walk through a pinch point where you feel that you can identify, okay, if I were a cougar or I were a predator, I would be doing this. So that's why I'm doing this in this exact spot, this exact place, right? We call it a pinch point. But now it's kind of looking like not only are those places identified when we're in the wilderness, but these little patches of thick brush, right, that are right next to a tree that has an opening that, maybe 4 or 5 guys could squeeze through. Regardless, it's a game trail. So those are things that, I've sketched down and are definitely in the back of my mind that, if I am going to continue my hunting career, but those are places we all got to look out for, right?
Kind of takes us back to our Army training, about cover and concealment.
Exactly. And, I think the light infantry guys could learn something from these things, But
listen, fellas, we're running short on time. Dalton, any advice to people out there listening, based on your experiences?
Yeah, my number one advice is don't go out looking for these things. I highly advise against that. I just told my experience. I may have made some wrong decisions, but it was a personal thing. to push me back over the edge and get me back in the saddle so that I could still continue to be a hunter and enjoy my time. But what we learned as a collective group out there, and the collective group that I had, better be sensitive about this, 2 of the guys are still operators. So these are the guys that are protecting you when you're asleep. These are the guys that are willing to do everything. And all 6 of us out there have had combined massive amounts of time overseas. And my guidance and advice would be, even with the guys that we were out there, 2 of the guys don't even want to go back out there. They want nothing to do with this. And these are guys with silver and bronze stars. So my advice is that if you do go out, it's always strength in numbers. Pay attention to places that you can identify as a pinch point. So like what Will was saying, stay away from brushy areas. Stay in the open. And if you're going to stay in an area, make sure you change your routine up. Do not stay. I will tell you, one of the main reasons we got in trouble is because we stayed there more than 4 days in a row. So change your routine up, change your habits up, and don't go out looking for a fight with these things. Guys can talk about calibers, guys can speculate all they want. These things are about 4 to 5 feet wide and damn near just as thick. So
and they don't just
play the
bubble around
ballistics.
slowly. They're extremely fast and agile.
Yes. These things are apex predators, man. And they are better than you in that environment. So, I don't mean to want to seem like a hard ass or deter, but, I can only give it on my best honest opinion and advice. My experience was extremely intense. That doesn't mean that's going to be everybody's experience, but yeah, don't put yourself in a situation that is going to end up maybe with the involvement of these things, unless you're prepared to go all the way. So,
yeah, and I could offer one
that's
piece
what I got
also.
to say.
A bad choice could be your last choice.
That's right. Will says you're going to end up a sack lunch if you make the wrong decision.
That's right. You could be
Don't make the bad choice.
Tom, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, just one final thought, and that was, you talked about the pinch point. I interviewed a gal today who also she's in a different part of the country, and she was talking about how these things actually manipulated some of the terrain, some of the brush and that sort of stuff in the local area to create a pinch point. So if you see that, you may want to turn around immediately and have your situational awareness up at 110%.
Well, Dalton, we certainly appreciate it.
More than welcome.
We're sorry you had such a frightening summer, but glad for the elk hunt.
Yes. And thanks for helping me process, guys. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
You bet.
Well, we're back from the break, everyone. Brian, let's go ahead and start with you. I know we have some questions from listeners, and then we'll just go ahead and go from there.
Yeah, so one question came in from Tara, and I told her that I would ask you about this, but she asks, why are there so many sightings of male creatures and not female? And I have an answer to that, but I want to get your answer to that, like what you think about that.
Well, I suspect that since they're in groups that are, I guess you could call them family type groups, because there may be some variations in that. It's not going to be just a group out wandering together. They have sentries that are on the outside that sort of protect the group with warnings and such. And they're typically males, younger males. Then there's the males that are, and just like with other, if we look at chimps and other primates, the males are typically the ones that are sort of on the outside protecting, females and young. So the females and young are going to be farther away from exposure to humans and other threats.
Yeah, that's exactly what my response was too, is that probably the females are going to be more kind of in the background, and the males are going to be more kind of explorers to that. And also another explanation might be that when you see a creature that could be, 7 or 8 foot tall, or even taller than that, and most sightings don't take place over a long period of time. They're just a few seconds. So when you see something like that, your first reaction is that it's got to be a male, not a female.
Well, and I can give you a little further insight too. We talked about what went on at Yakult, and when you see the Patterson, we're comparing the Patterson film with what the folks in Yakult saw. When you see what's in the Patterson film, the creature has very full breasts, full of milk, or what appears to be anyway. What the folks in Yakult saw, they did see the female. I told them there was probably one in the area. They did see one night under the bright, not a street light, but very close in brightness in their yard. The creature was underneath that, and they said it had breasts, but they appeared to be empty. So if you were to see a creature like that in that condition, and most primates, the females don't have milk in their breasts unless they're feeding young. So humans are the exception to that, of course. But that may very well be a misidentification. People may see females and think they're males because they don't see the breasts.
Right. That's exactly what I think too, is that there might be a lot of misidentifications where people think that they're seeing a male, but it actually could be a female.
It's possible, sure.
Yeah.
I got a follow-up question on that. Brian, that's an excellent question. What do we have any encounters where people have reported, besides Patty and Yakult, where they've seen definitely a female?
Oh yeah, we do get them occasionally. They're not as much as the other, people seeing males and juveniles, but occasionally.
Okay, interesting.
And Will, kind of a follow-up to that, going back to the Patty, because she did clearly have breasts, do you think that she was feeding or nursing the young at that time when they got the film?
Well, it's certainly possible. I mean, it's something we don't know a great deal about yet, but if you look at, comparative anthropology, you could make that assumption.
Mm-hmm.
Tom, go ahead, Brian.
Oh, no, I was just going to ask how, because we don't really know about lifespan, but we can kind of guess based on other primates. Do they age in a similar way to humans? I mean, so for example, their faces get wrinkled. Do they drop in height? Because I know that as people get older, a lot of times they shrink in size. Is there any evidence to that?
Well, that's kind of a big unknown. There have been individuals that have been seen in areas for years, like the big gray one that we saw back in 1988. That one didn't seem to change appearance over that time. So I'm guessing when it was first seen in the area, probably 20 years or so prior to our sighting of it, it was described almost in identical fashion as what we saw. So while it is possible that they do age, and you look at chimps, you can tell older ones from younger ones. Obviously, they do have some changes. So I'm assuming these things will make similar changes in appearance.
And probably with color.
It's possible, sure, but it's possible they stay the same also.
Yeah.
It's just one of those areas we don't know much about, if anything, really.
Mm-hmm. So, Tom, what's the other first listener question?
Okay, so this is a good one. This is from Tanner. He's in Oregon. Tanner wants to know, he says, I have a question for Will. He goes, I'm curious if we've heard of historical reports from around the Grants Pass area or Southern Oregon in general, or reliable accounts from the far Southern Oregon region, somewhere around the California border and towards the coast of obviously, of Sasquatch? And I think I know the answer, but, well, I'll wait here.
Oh yeah, lots of reports. One of the more interesting ones was, of course, we've talked about this many times, was that Renee Danden told me the Patterson Sasquatch tracks were found up near the California-Oregon border in 1980. But there's plenty of accounts, lots and lots of them, from Grants Pass out to the coast, especially the Port Orford area, but not just there, but lots of areas. I mean, you can look back in John Green's books and see lots and lots of accounts from southern Oregon and northern California.
And I just want to comment on Witness of the Unknown, your first volume, volume 1. There's a real interesting historical account, and I believe it's Port Orford, of some miners that had a very negative experience with one of these creatures. Negative to the point that some of those miners didn't survive.
Yeah, there was, things on the Chetco River. There were Thompson Flat. There were lots of areas. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. You can go to any part of that region and find accounts, that go way back into the 1800s to present times.
Right. And I just want to say that what I find fascinating is the historical accounts pretty much harmonize, the behavior-wise with modern accounts, vice versa as well.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of difference. I mean, you can look, like I've said many times before, over geography and time, and the accounts are very similar.
One of the questions that I had is, how distinct are their footprints? In other words, if you find tracks, can you tell, like, a couple years later if it was the same creature?
Yes. Footwear is very distinctive, and I don't mean shoes. I mean how the foot wears, how it moves, how a particular individual utilizes its feet, the wear patterns, and things like that. Structurally, they're different from one another.
And because they do have such a large range, I think you said like 500 miles, are you able to identify the same creature, the same footprint that might be, 30 miles off of the first print?
Absolutely. One of the best examples was, I can't remember if it was Green or Bob Titmus. They mentioned a foot that was found one year in the Bluff Creek area. The next year it was 150 miles south of there. So, yeah, they're very distinctive from one another. I mean, while they all have the same general structure and appearance, you can identify individuals very easily.
Right. So it's kind of like a fingerprint almost that you can. Everybody's hand looks alike in a lot of ways, right. But there are certain things that you can definitely tell.
Exactly, certain characteristics, and no two individuals are identical to one another. So the feet are very characteristic of that. So you can identify individuals pretty easily.
A follow-up to that question would be, if you're to watch a certain individual, and over time, could you use that information to kind of forecast or predict locations? In other words, Will, I've heard you talk about over time, you've actually been able to predict within, I think, 2 weeks when a certain group will arrive in a certain area. And my question is, could you actually use that unique footprint of an individual or individuals to help predict when and where they're going to be?
Yeah, you can get a pretty good idea. I followed one group for more than a decade, actually 12 years, and I could get within a 30-day window of generally where they were going to be, and it was pretty accurate. Of course, that group was fairly undisturbed by people, so there were not a whole lot of external factors influencing their movements, thankfully, so they were fairly predictable. So you have to count, when you're looking at groups and tracking them, there are a lot of factors that play into that, whether you can make predictions. But if they're unmolested by people, for the most part, you can get a pretty accurate idea, although they're going to change their feeding areas year to year, but they're going to be in the ballpark area of where they're coming through. I mean, for instance, if in, let's say, May, they're in one particular seed in one particular area, and if there's a history of that, there might be different locations they're at within that general area, but they predictably can be in that general area each May, for example.
So some of the factors that possibly could influence them, I would imagine, would be, for example, if they're in an area that they, you've got to, like you said, you can kind of predict within a 30-day period. I would imagine, so my question is, what about logging? Let's say they logged a section in there. Could that be possibly something that might affect their behavior?
Yes. Any man-produced activity in an area is going to alter what they're doing.
Okay. And then the other part of that question would be, what is the purpose of moving around? Is it strictly for not exhausting the food supplies in an area?
Two main reasons. It helps you avoid, generally the term would be predators, but and they may view us that way. So it's going to avoid dangers. We'll say dangers, not just predators. We'll just say dangers. And to not exhaust the food supply in an area.
So Tom, that was a great question, and kind of to segue off of that, Will, I just looked up today the statistics for white-tailed deer and overpopulation in the United States. And in 1930, they said that the population was about 300,000, but today it's about 30 million. That's a 1,000-fold increase in less than 100 years. And so I guess my question is, do you think that increase in the deer population might lead to an increase in the Sasquatch population?
No, absolutely. And logging caused that. We've talked about this a number of times. When you log an area that historically has been forested, and that forest cover only allows a certain percentage of sunlight to reach the floor of the forest, so you get very limited leafy plants growing in those places. So food supply controls an animal population that eats that, and then the predator population is going to be corresponding to that population size. When they open those areas up, lots and lots of leafy plants grow in. It takes trees much longer to repopulate an area. So you can have a decade or more of leafy plant growth, which means the animals that eat those plants are going to populate exponentially because the food supply is greater, and then so will the predator population will correspond to that. So yeah, their population has grown quite a lot.
I got that's an excellent question, Brian, because that kind of goes along the direction I was thinking, and that is, we talked about very recently the conflict between humans and chimps in Africa, that article we discussed. So if the deer population is exploding, this is a rhetorical question, the Bigfoot population is exploding, are we seeing conflicts now between competitive Bigfoot groups, and are we seeing an increase of conflict between Bigfoot and humans?
I don't think there's so much of a conflict between the creatures, different groups of them, and not really so much conflicts with people. We're seeing more encroachment. Not so much us into the forest. I mean, we're out there anyway, and have been for some time. But what we're seeing because of that population growth is we're getting more sightings and things like that going on.
Well, kind of a follow-up to that, do you think that at some point they're going to stop being less confrontational and they might become more confrontational with humans?
It's possible, sure. If the pressure increases, then, I mean, they're not the nicest creature anyway. So, some of that unfavorable behavior will become more apparent.
Right, because just what I'm saying is that they kind of view us as a predator, but I just kind of wonder if at some point, probably not anytime immediately, but at some point if they're going to become more aggressive towards humans.
Well, they're opportunistic, so it really depends on that factor. What's in it for them if they do that, because it is a much greater danger messing with humans.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of along the same lines of thinking, is there a possibility that a group within a certain area could depopulate, the food supply in that area?
It's possible, sure. I mean, depending on, how much mobility the group has or various groups in an area. But if they're overpopulated, sure, it's very possible that they can exhaust a food supply in an area. But typically they move, so, for at least the foreseeable future, that shouldn't be a big problem.
And Will, kind of a follow-up question to that is, because I know that you talked about how there's like a 500-mile range.
At least,
but
yeah.
But do you see groups that kind of stay in the same location?
Sometimes they'll stay in an area for a prolonged time period, but if the ranges are typically large and they overlap, so there really isn't any advantage to staying in a particular location over time, because you can exhaust a food supply, and dangers to individuals or the group. Oh, I'm getting some feedback there. Can you guys hear that?
Yeah. I got it too.
Okay, I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, I don't hear it now, so that happened earlier when Brian and I were talking, so yeah, there really isn't much an advantage. You're moving because you're avoiding possible dangers to your group, and then the food supply thing is also. I mean, they probably don't intentionally think they're not exhausting a food supply, but by keeping moving every 2 weeks to different feeding areas, you end up not exhausting your food supply in that area. So I hope that answered the question. I got sidetracked with that noise, that feedback.
Oh, no. Good answer. So another question is that when they come into, and you can actually talk about your own personal experience about this, but when you hear about witness encounters, do these creatures actually growl? I mean, do they vocalize and kind of snarl at you? Or
we've gotten reports of that. I've heard them growl. So yeah, that does happen.
I want to go back a little bit to, we're talking about the, they got a home range of, you said it's a minimum of 500 square miles.
Well, here's the thing. In southern Washington, that group had 3,300 square miles they occupied, and I think the range is actually larger than that because they went across the Columbia River into northern Oregon as well.
Wow. Okay. Do they? And I've heard commentaries on this, and I don't know. I can't recall where, but that they have both a home range, okay, which is pretty large, but they also have a core area, which would be, I'm assuming, would be like where, when they're within a certain area, the core area was going to be where they go and bed down, probably for the day or whenever. Is that accurate, or do you have any ideas on that?
Well, actually, the terminology wouldn't be used like that. The core area would indicate, a place, kind of a home area, and that's not really what they do. And I'm basing this off 12 years of study of that particular group as they move throughout the range. Now, when they're, let's say, in a 24-hour cycle, they have places where they sleep, and they don't sleep 8 hours like we do, folks. But we'll just call it a sleep area, and they'll range out from that area to hunt, and then they'll come back. So there's that aspect, but every 2 weeks they're moving those feeding areas, so that's how they move throughout their ranges throughout the year.
It's interesting because I think I'm sure elk and deer do the same thing. They have times when they bed down for a little bit. But again, they don't put in an 8-hour night or day of sleeping.
No.
I think they bed down for a bit, and then they forage and, move around. So they're constantly mobile.
I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of a dangerous thing. We sort of adapted it, and they think it's because of social or the construct or development of towns and things like that, where we have these safe areas where we can sleep, and because our work and things like that are sort of based on that system. Whereas animals in the wild, if you were to sleep for 8-9 hours, you're more susceptible to predation. So it's kind of in your favor to only sleep short time periods, but throughout a 24-hour cycle.
Yeah. And I think I've even seen video of elk where people are walking through the woods at nighttime, and there's an elk standing there, apparently asleep, sleeping on its legs, and then it becomes aware of the presence of the person with a camera, obviously, and then it just it gets disturbed and kind of moves on, but you can tell that it just sort of woke up out of a little mini sleep cycle.
Mm-hmm.
and kept walking. And I'm assuming these creatures might possibly do something similar, or...
Yeah, again, it's something we don't know a great deal about, so it's definitely something interesting to consider, but they probably sleep just like the animals they prey on, just short periods, throughout that cycle.
And so, Will, do you think that for the most part they're family units, or do they ever link up with other groups?
For the most part, I would say family type units. Could be other individuals that belong to a group also that aren't family. Like the group in southern Washington, there were actually 3 groups in that area that occupy that large area that I talked about, 3,300 plus square miles. The 2 main groups, they stay quite a bit away from each other. One is basically South Mount St. Helens. The other one is Mount Adams, western Mount Adams, that is. There are probably others in that area, but and then there's a group of 3 males that sort of float around in between. So, occasionally, one or more of those individuals will go temporarily with one of those other groups, but then they usually split off. So, and sometimes the groups will band together for a time period for whatever reason, and they'll go their separate ways.
I got a question, kind of a follow-up to that, and that is, in the family structure of each group, so you got an alpha male, and then you've got the other members, right? I'm just curious in their hunting, and I understand this is pure speculation, but it's just an interesting thought. Do we think that maybe the alpha males dictate behavior and dictate hunting strategies? So in other words, you got an alpha male, you may have a group that behaves one way, but eventually the alpha male is kicked out or whatever happens, with primates, and you get a new one that comes in. You kind of got the same group, although some new members, and it may have an entirely different profile of behavior.
Absolutely. I watched the thing on National Geographic a while back here, and one part of it they kept the focus on a group of baboons, and the one leader of the group was kind of a bad leader, and treated some of the members badly. In fact, there was a scene where they were in close proximity to. Geez, what is going on? I'm getting feedback again. Hold on, fellas. Okay, is that... Okay. I still hear it. What is going on with this thing? Okay, let me try to talk. I'm going to have to edit this stuff out. The baboon, they were in close proximity to an alligator or a crocodile, and the alpha, the leader of the group, was actually in danger of being eaten by the thing, and none of the members liked this particular leader, and they were going to let him be eaten until the leader figured out what was there, and then the relationship was never the same. That alpha did end up getting killed, I think, by a big cat, and one of the members that had been picked on by this alpha ended up taking over the group. So the demeanor of the group and its behavior was very clearly dictated by the leader of the group. So we've seen the one alpha and how the group behaved one way, and then when the next one took over, it was very different. So I suspect the same thing is true with the Sasquatch.
You know, it's funny because they'll just sit around and, just silently waiting. Maybe he's going to get chomped on.
It was like they were all turning their backs, all ignoring. And usually they would raise the alarm, when there's some kind of danger. And in this case, they didn't. They were like, okay, go ahead and get eaten, dude.
Yeah, what's funny about that is, as you see parallels in the workplace as well, let's face it, we've all had bad bosses, and they do things that you're like, okay, we're just going to watch them go down in flames. Nobody's going to do anything to rescue them.
Yeah, exactly. I think everybody has some kind of a story they can relate like that.
Yeah, I just found that kind of amusing.
Yeah, so there are lots of parallels. I mean, if you're looking at Sasquatch behavior, look at other primates, you're going to see very similar things.
Yeah, we'll kind of a question too on that point, and this might be like a weird question, but are there vocalizations like monkeys? I mean, do they have mating calls?
Well, that's a good question. Something we don't know. A lot of those vocals, we get lots of vocals, lots of different types of vocals they do. What they mean, who knows? We don't, at this point, we really don't know. It's just all speculation, but they may have. There may be some sort of a, call that indicates that. But some of the sounds are going to be group specific, or maybe within an area, maybe different groups. Let's say like that range in southern Washington. Let's say among those three groups, maybe they understand some of the same vocals between each other. It's hard to tell.
Kind of along the same lines of that, I mean, they seem to have a wide range of different types of vocalizations they make. Everything from whistles to owl hoots to screams, barks, reports. And I'm just curious if you've heard this report that they do actually make sounds similar to monkeys or chimps or something like that.
Yeah, I've actually heard sounds, out near Mount Rainier that sound very similar to chimp noises. Was it exactly like chimps? No, it was very similar to chimps. So, I mean, that's the only thing I can think to compare the noises to. We talked about the two individuals a group of us heard one evening. One was not making chimp noises. The other one was. They were close together, maybe 20 feet apart from one another.
Wow. And, of course, we know there are no chimps in North America, naturally.
Correct.
What about, and I've also heard, and I'm just curious on this point as well, that people have reported chest beating, like I think gorillas do. Have you heard that? And any thoughts?
I've heard that from a couple different witnesses. At least that's what they thought, what it sounded like. It wasn't any object hitting another object like, rocks or trees or things like that. They said it sounded like exactly like what you hear when you hear a gorilla beat his chest, fist on flesh. So, yeah, I have heard that 2-3 times.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay. And, go ahead, Tom.
Oh, go ahead, Brian.
No, I was just going to ask to Will, and actually you, Tom, as well, if you know this, but do other primates have, because we hear reports that their arms hang almost by their knees. Is that the same with other primates as well?
Yeah, I think typically, chimps and gorillas, other monkeys, their arms hang a little bit lower, they're longer. These things, their general design is, I guess, a little bit more simian-like than human in proportion. The torso, the body's longer than humans are in proportion. Legs are shorter, arms are longer, things like that.
You know, that's a good point. And the question I have is, when you look at if you look at a gibbon, you know, look it up on the internet or in the zoo or whatever, I've often thought that they, in some ways, their physical structure resembles a Bigfoot, only 1 meter tall. You know, they're about 3 feet tall. Will, what are your thoughts? Just wonder if you might have a comment on that. I don't know about the facial structure, but
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. In the early days, people like John Napier and some of the other early anthropologists who were taking a look at this subject kind of compared these things to gibbons, and it was probably that morphological similarity.
yeah, and they're interesting. They're super fast, very agile. I've heard that they've been recorded going through the jungle somewhere around 34 or 35 miles an hour.
Yeah,
I don't know.
And these things, I mean, it's possible they're related to gibbons. We simply don't know at this point.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
interesting.
And Will, kind of another question too. With that being said, because their arms do hang longer than humans, I mean, is that kind of a evolutionary adaptation that helps them, hunt prey like deer?
It could be just a leftover, you know, I mean, from, you know, a more ape-like past.
Mhm.
Now, it could be something that helps them, but I don't think it's a special adaptation because there's so many similarities with other primates that have, you know, those same characteristics.
Mhm. And do you think that their physical description has changed over the years, or has it kind of always been the same? And of course, obviously, that might depend on the type and the area of the country that people are seeing these things. But
Yeah,
has there been
I don't
general?
think, no, it hasn't changed. The only difference being we're getting more reports of other variations now where we didn't before.
Mhm.
Now, when you talk about variations, are you talking about the 4 basic types of Sasquatch?
Yeah, the four groupings or types, and even among those or in those different groupings, there's variations. So, you know, depending on breeding populations, things like that, there's going to be minor variations here and there, and then you have individual variation. So, you get some differences, but not any real appreciable difference.
Right, like you were also saying earlier about the different footprints. Like every individual has their own unique stamp, basically.
Yes, exactly.
Mhm.
And then even in that, you know, we see people that report sometimes there's, you know, maybe an extra toe or lacking a toe. You know, that's going to happen. You know, accidents, things like that. I mean, look at the cripple foot tracks from the early 70s in northeastern Washington, you know, where the one foot was obviously deformed, the other one wasn't. I mean, you're walking around in nature, things happen. So,
Mhm.
you know, there's lots of variations to consider in there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Lee even talked about that with some of his encounters when he was in California, that there was one of them was, he said the face looked like it was maybe had a Down syndrome, and one of them had a deformed foot, um, you know, susceptible to some sort of maybe it got damaged at some point.
Yeah, the facial look might be just how a person relates to whatever they see. You know, when they hear Down syndrome, it's not, the Sasquatch doesn't have Down syndrome. It's just that's the first thing that comes to mind maybe when they see a particular individual, you know, how it strikes them. The foot problems, yeah, there's going to be all kinds of issues with feet and things. So, you know, whether it's accidents or how they're born, things like that.
And actually, related to that, going back to, we were talking about do they have mating calls and things like that. Do you think that there's maybe a significant problem with them with inbreeding that might lead to some, you know, deformations and things like that?
For the most part, I don't think so, but there are places where on the continent where they really don't breed a whole lot outside of that general area. So in those places, it could be a problem.
Mm-hmm. And how often do you come across reports of them missing toes and things like that? I mean, like you said, like in nature, everything's going to happen. But just out of curiosity, how often do you get reports or even footprints of them like missing a toe or something like that?
It's actually pretty seldom. I've seen a lot of footprints and over the years and stuff. People send me a lot, and it's actually pretty rare. It does happen occasionally, but it's more rare than you think. It probably corresponds to even our own population where it's not a real high percentage.
Mm-hmm. And another question is, and I think I know what your answer might be, but we hear periodically reports where they have an extra digit. And I don't know if that's just speculation or just sort of, stuff on the internet. But have you heard of any that have 6 digits instead of 5?
It's rare. I've heard of it. In fact, I've got a cast on the desk in front of me here from the early 60s here in Northern California. And the little toe, it could give you the impression that it's actually 2. It's kind of misshapen, but I suspect it's just a single toe. It's not 2. There's no real division. It's just wider than one would expect. But that could be simply where or how that toe developed. I mean, there's all sorts of variations, but all the other prints are pretty standard. I mean, there's not a whole lot of difference. But that extra digit, it's very, very rare. I mean, I have heard of it once or twice, but it's not very common.
And that also probably leads to speculation that a lot of those examples might be hoaxes that people did.
And they could be, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's always that factor.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, you hear the speculation about not necessarily these things, but giants with double rows of teeth. And I heard recently the best explanation on that is clear up into the late 1800s and 1800s. Yeah, 1900s. So late 18th century and 19th century. Double rows of teeth was simply a way that dentists would explain that you had uppers and lowers.
Mm-hmm.
It did not mean that you had 2 sets of lowers and 2 sets of uppers.
Right. First of all, you have to think, number one, we're not sharks. Primates don't grow teeth like that. Secondly, what would the purpose be in an evolutionary sense? There wouldn't be. And thirdly, name a primate species anywhere that currently or previously existed that had 2 sets of teeth. There aren't any.
Yeah, right. And it would be a real huge disadvantage.
It would be. It would be. Yeah, I just, in a primate species, I see no purpose for it. And you have to think about along those lines. What would be the evolutionary purpose of having something like that? How would it benefit the species?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it would be a huge, huge disadvantage.
People jump to a lot of speculative conclusions that really have no basis in fact.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of that, Will, have there ever been any dental teeth that have been found?
No, not of the Sasquatch, at least not that anybody's produced. Now, there have been bones found, and one of my favorite stories is the one that was in John Green's book about the couple, that were prospecting on their vacation, and the wife took the creature's jaw home, and it sat on the mantelpiece for 14 years, till the house burned down. But as far as actually having one to examine, no.
It's interesting though because we had John, an anthropologist, on a few episodes back,
right?
And he made an interesting comment that it's possible that sitting in boxes somewhere in a lab or wherever at a university,
sure, misidentified.
Yeah, misidentified bones just sitting there, and nobody's.
Yeah. No, there could be lots of bones of them in these facilities that are misidentified as human remains. I mean, there are pieces of bone. There are pieces of skeletons, found frequently, and there are facilities where they're sent because they're presumed to be human, and they really don't know what to do with them, so they warehouse them. So yeah, there certainly could be plenty of bones, actually in these facilities.
Well, it would make sense, because if somebody found some bones out in the woods, nobody's going to, there's no baseline, no standard to say, hey, look, there we go. We got another set of Bigfoot dentition or skeleton or anything.
Right. And as John pointed out, they may very well look very human in appearance. So they would report them, and like I say, fingers, things like that, they get found all the time. So they would go to one of these facilities and they'd just be warehoused.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, a great point too. It kind of makes me wish that Forensic Files was still on, because I wonder if with science changing and technology changing, if they were able to maybe look at a skull or different bones, that they were able to conclusively prove that, hey, no, this is not human. This has to be Sasquatch.
The problem with that is there are many thousands of these bones or bone fragments in these facilities. Where do you start looking? It would take decades to go through stuff like that, and then you get variation among people. So how do you determine
exactly
what's not human?
Again, it goes back to there's no baseline of recognized. If you do find a Sasquatch, bone fragments or whatever, there's no way to identify it.
Exactly. How would you know?
And same thing with hair too.
Yeah, hair. You gotta have examples. Known. With hair, you would have to have something in the database that was a known sample. In other words, it was taken directly off the body of one of these creatures. In a with a chain of custody. So just finding something out on a tree limb somewhere isn't gonna cut it when it comes to that sort of thing. So hair doesn't really do you a whole lot of good anyway.
Right.
Sorry about that. I was moving my coffee cup here. This microphone picks up every bit of noise.
No. Hey, so Will, and also Tom, you can weigh in this on as well. What do you think that the position for law enforcement is on these creatures? I mean, do you think that a lot of people in the, not necessarily government per se, but I mean just police officers in general, do they know about this creature? Are they willing to say that, hey, it exists? Or
well, from my experience, talking with police officers, we know a few, they knew about it. Some agencies do. Some the police officers out on the street may not know, but if they come across something, their higher ups may know. Typically, it's a career killer, so they steer clear of it. Typically it's something they just don't want to mess with.
One question I often just kind of toyed with is not so much the police officers, but the legal status that this creature might have. Would it be unique, or would it be when they do discover when there's an official acknowledgement of their existence, what kind of legal status would they have because they're a hominid? Would they have something elevated above the regular animals, or would it be would it just, and again, it's just pure speculation at this point, would it just be another creature, another animal?
Well, no, once they're officially recognized as being quote unquote discovered, which is actually, it's an affirmation of rediscoveries, what it will actually be, since our ancestors knew about these things very well. And I'm talking way back before pre-recorded history. The Endangered Species Act would kick in, and in however many years it takes, those groups of individuals they choose to figure this out, then of course, once they figure out what they are, then they'll make a determination on that. So at this point, it's just speculation. But the Endangered Species Act would kick in, and then those procedures would be followed. So,
and the
nightmare.
The logging industry would be devastated by that because they'd have to shut down the whole thing.
Yeah, because they have to figure out habitat.
Right.
Yeah, or make a determination on what they need and their habitat requirements and all that stuff. So yeah.
And these creatures, from what we know, is they're anything but endangered at this point.
Well, that's what we know, but they still have to go through all of that stuff, and that's a federal law that automatically kicks in when something new is discovered.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever people's opinions are, it doesn't matter. That's the way the law is written, and that's how it would go.
Yeah, and actually, talking about population, do you think that there is obviously, you think that these creatures are definitely populating at a pretty good rate. But how is it in terms of regions of the country? I mean, are they obviously in the Pacific Northwest, but are they kind of, populating in like different regions in the country?
Yeah, it seems to be. I mean, it's not obviously not the same population everywhere. They're not evenly distributed, but we're getting reports of juveniles in lots of locations around the country and Canada.
It'd be interesting to see a heat map, Ryan, that would show the relating to the sightings. And then you could differentiate between juveniles and the size and the color and the types and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's not something we're going to get though.
Oh, probably not.
But talking about juveniles, that is a pretty good indication that the population is definitely increasing, because if there are younger ones, then they're certainly going to grow in numbers.
It's a clear indicator. In years past, we didn't get a lot of those kind of reports. In the past year or two, we're getting lots of reports. Now, is it that more people are opening up about this? Or number two, are they actually seeing more? And from what I'm seeing from people is these are fairly recent, meaning in the past year or two, these sightings of juveniles. So the indicator points to this growing young population.
So that, it brings up another question, and that is, if the population continues to increase, do you think we might hit critical mass at some point where it's just impossible to deny their existence?
It's certainly possible. It just depends on what happens with the population. At some point, does it reach, the apex of where its growth is and start declining? We don't know.
Wasn't there, I think I remember a while back that back in the 50s, the estimated population was around 50,000, and now it's...
For the continent, yeah.
For the continent, yeah, right. And then it's in the 6 digits now.
It's at least double that. I mean, and that could be a natural progression, but logging has certainly played a big part in that growth, and we know that. So,
and just going back to the earlier point I made about the deer population. I mean, 300,000 back in the 1920s, and now it's 30 million. It's like more than 1,000-fold increase in just the last, few decades.
Sure.
That's
and when you look at the last few decades, look what happened. Prior to that was all that logging, so you had time for the leafy plants to grow, and then the animals that eat those plants, their population grew exponentially according to that. So it's very reasonable to, when you have 1 + 2 = 3, you have 1 logging plus deer population growing, 3 is the predator population growing in accordance with that population growth.
Mm-hmm.
And another question I have in regards to the numbers. What did you say it was, Brian? It was 300,000. Now it's...
Yeah, now it's 30 million. they estimate.
So 1,000-fold. Do they have different, how do they predict that? Are they using algorithms? Are they using some kind of software that predicts? Because they have to have some way. I mean, you really can't. I can't imagine going out there and just manually counting that many deer or anything.
Yeah, so it is kind of speculation and just estimation, but
you have like some percentage, like maybe 5 or 10% error. Still,
we can probably get our biologist friend Adam on at some point, and that's kind of one of the areas he looks at, and he can answer that question, specifically for us.
That's a good question, because I'm just thinking in terms, like, for example, here in Oregon, ODFW, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, predicts, I believe the number is 35,000 black bear in Oregon, which is a lot of bears. And I think a lot of them are on the coast, and then there's pretty good distribution from the Cascades going east. And this goes back to the bones. To my understanding, there's never been a single set of black bear bones found in the wild where the bear died of natural causes.
Correct.
Yeah, so if we can believe that black bears exist, nobody argues that. That puts the argument that no bones have been found at Bigfoot just doesn't make sense.
Fellas, we're just about out of time on the Q&A. Any final points before we wrap this segment up?
No, just saying happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
Yeah, and likewise.
All right, everybody, we're going to take a quick break. Stand by for Jim's reading.
Welcome. This story is being brought to you by William Jevning and is being narrated by me, Jim Sower. The title of this story, The Valley of Peace in the Olympics, a Seattle legend. An excerpt from L.E. Clark's Indian Legends of the Pacific Northwest. Olympic National Park is located in the U.S. state of Washington in the Olympic Peninsula. The park can be divided into 3 basic regions: the Pacific Coastline, the Olympic Mountains, and the Temperate Forest. A great-grandmother of Clarence Pickernell, he is a combination of Quinault, Chehalis, Cowlitz Indian, told him she was sure that the following story is a genuine Indian legend. She had not heard this version before, but she had heard a similar one. Eugene Semple, who recorded the version given here, was governor of Washington Territory in the 1880s. In the days long gone by, the Indians had a sacred place in the heart of the Olympic Mountains. It was a valley, wide and level, with peaks high on every side. The base of the mountains was covered with cedar, fir, and pine, which stayed green throughout the year. A small stream murmured through the valley, and flowers of many kinds grew on its banks and spread through the meadows. It was a place of peace, for it was held sacred by all the neighboring tribes. Once every year, all the Indian nations, even those that at other times made war upon each other, gathered in the Valley of Peace. Coming from all directions, they climbed the trails to the summits of the mountains and gazed upon the beautiful valley below them. Then they put away their weapons of war, went down into the valley, and greeted their former enemies with signs of peace. There they traded with each other and enjoyed games and contests of strength and skill. These friendly gatherings were held for many years in the Valley of Peace. But Seatko, chief of all the evil spirits, became angry with the people who gathered there. Seatko was a giant who could trample whole tribes under his feet. He was taller than the tallest fir trees. His voice was louder than the roar of the ocean, and his face was more terrible to look upon than the face of the fiercest wild beast. He could travel by land, in the water, and in the air. He was so strong that he could tear up a whole forest by the roots and heap rocks into mountains. By just blowing his breath, he could change the course of rivers. This demon became angry without a reason at all the nations that gathered in the Valley of Peace. One year, when they were there for trading and for contests of peace, Siatko came along with them. He caused the earth and water to swallow the people. Not many Indians escaped. A few rushed away in time to save themselves from the anger of Siatko. They returned to their villages to warn their people to stay away from the valley. The Indians never went there again. An excerpt from Ella E. Clark's Indian Legends of the Pacific Northwest. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open out there.